She slapped a 60-year-old woman in a hotel breakfast room. And the man sitting at the next table was worth more money than she would ever see in her life. She did not know that either. But he had seen everything. Welcome to Visa's Tales. If you are new here, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel, so you never miss a story. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into it. The Grand Ivory Hotel was the kind of place where everything was expensive and nothing was accidental. The flowers in the lobby were changed every morning. The lighting was calibrated to make everyone look slightly better than they were. The staff moved like water, always present, never intrusive, trained to make the wealthy feel that the world was running specifically for them. Clara worked the breakfast shift. She was 26 years old, second year of night school for hospitality management, and had been at the Grand Ivory for 18 months without a single complaint filed against her. She was not the fastest server on the floor, but she was the most consistent. She remembered which guests took sugar, which guests preferred their eggs runny, and which guests needed 2 minutes of silence before they were ready to be spoken to. She had learned, mostly from her mother, and partly from 4 years of difficult work, that people revealed their true character in the small moments. Not the grand gestures, but the way they spoke to someone who could not speak back. That morning, Table 7 was Vivian Cole. Clara had seen her type before. Not the specific woman, the type. The ones who arrived already disappointed, who treated menus like they were being personally insulted by the options, who spoke to staff the way you speak to a vending machine that is not dispensed correctly. They were not always cruel people. Sometimes they were simply people who had never been required to consider anyone who could not push back. The requirement changes you. The absence of it changes you differently. Vivian was the kind of woman who made a room aware of itself. She arrived in a cream silk blouse and dark trousers that probably cost more than Clara's monthly salary, with the specific ease of someone who had never once worried about a bill. She was beautiful in the sharp way that demands acknowledgement. High cheekbones, perfect posture, the kind of red lip that said I'm not trying, and both of us know that is a lie. She sat, looked at the menu for 4 seconds, and set it down. Clara came over. Good morning, she said. Can I start you with? The coffee is cold, Vivian said. She had not tasted it. Clara looked at the cup. It had been placed 60 seconds ago. It was not cold. She said, I am sorry. Let me bring you a fresh one. Vivian looked up at her for the first time. She looked the way some people look at furniture, registering the presence without acknowledging the person. Is this your first week? She said. No, ma'am. 18 months. Vivian smiled. It was not a kind smile. Then you should know better. Clara said nothing. She took the cup and went to the kitchen. At the service station near the kitchen door, an older woman named Grace was restocking napkins. Grace was perhaps 60, with the slow movements of someone whose knees had been giving her trouble for years and who had never once mentioned it. She had worked at the Grand Ivory for 11 years. She was the person who had shown Clara which tables were difficult and which guests needed extra time, and how to tell the difference between a guest who was having a bad day and a guest who was simply a bad person. Clara was pouring the fresh coffee when she heard it. The sound cut through the breakfast noise cleanly, not loud, but sharp. The specific sound of an open palm connecting with a face. She turned. Vivian was standing. Grace was beside her table. One hand pressed to her cheek, the other holding a coffee pot that had not spilled because her grip was that practiced, that automatic, even in shock. Vivian's eyes were cold. The expression on her face was not anger. It was annoyance. The way you look when a fly lands on your food. She touched me, Vivian said to no one in particular. Her voice was completely calm. I do not allow staff to touch me. The pot had brushed Vivian's sleeve as Grace leaned across to refill a guest's cup at the adjacent table. The brush had left no mark, no trace, nothing except the awareness that a 60-year-old woman had been slapped for a sleeve. The breakfast room had gone very quiet. Clara set down the coffee pot. She walked to Grace. She put her hand on Grace's arm and said, quietly, go to the back. I have got it. Grace went. Her face was the face of someone who had survived things by not letting them show. Clara turned to Vivian. She did not perform calm. She was calm, which was different. She said, I am going to need you to take a moment. Vivian looked at her as something close to amusement. Excuse me? What happened was an accident, Clara said. Grace has worked here for 11 years. She has never received a complaint. If you have a concern about the service, I would be happy to speak with the manager on your behalf. Vivian leaned slightly forward. Do you know who I am? Clara held her gaze. I know you are a guest at this hotel, and we would like you to have a good experience. But we will not accept our staff being treated that way. Clara paused. If you would like to continue your breakfast, I will personally ensure everything is to your standard. If not, I can arrange for your bill to be settled. The table nearby, the one Vivian had perhaps won an audience from, had 3 guests at it. One of them was looking at his phone. One was looking at the window. One was watching Clara with an expression that was very still and very attentive. Vivian sat back down. She did not apologize. She picked up her menu again, which she had already set down, and looked at it as though she were reading it. Clara went back to the kitchen. Her hands were not shaking. She was proud of that. The man at the nearby table watched her go. His name was James Cole. He was Vivian's husband. He was also, as of this morning, someone who had been watching his wife for reasons that had nothing to do with love. This required some explanation. James had built his company the way most things worth building are built. Slowly, then all at once. He had started at 22 with a single investment that most people in his life had told him was a mistake. It had not been a mistake. By 28 he had an office and 12 employees. By 32 he had an office in 3 cities and more employees than he could name individually, which bothered him. So he had started eating lunch in the staff canteen 3 times a week and learning names that way. He was not famous, which was precisely what he preferred. He had a habit, occasionally, of going places without the markers that announced what he was. No car, no assistant, no name badge of wealth. He found that people showed you who they really were when they had nothing to gain from pleasing you. But he was known in the circles where knowing someone meant something. He had met Vivian at a charity dinner 18 months before this morning. She had been funny and warm and the most present person in the room. Not in the way that demands attention, but in the way that makes you feel the room has become more interesting because of her arrival. He had proposed 6 months after meeting her, and they had married 4 months after that, because he was 33 and had been sensible about everything for long enough that he thought perhaps it was time to be less sensible. The marriage was 8 months old now. He had been watching her unravel for 6 of those 8 months. It had started small. A comment here. A tone there. The way she spoke about people who worked for her, which was different from the way she had spoken about people before they were married. He had told himself that stress did things to people. That adjustment took time. That the woman he had proposed to was still in there somewhere, beneath whatever was hardening around her. And then this morning, at breakfast, in the Grand Ivory Hotel where he had brought her for what he had told himself was a chance to reset. To find the version of the marriage he had believed in. Had watched his wife slap a 60-year-old woman on the face because a sleeve had touched her arm. He had not moved immediately. He had stayed in his seat because he wanted to see what came next, whether Vivian would catch herself, whether there would be a moment of awareness, a flinch of regret. There was not. And then the young server had come over, and James had watched something he had not seen in a very long time. Someone speaking truth to a person who expected compliance. Someone holding a line without raising their voice. Someone who clearly understood that dignity was not something you negotiated. He had stayed still and watched. He was still thinking about it when Vivian came back from whatever she had done after breakfast. A phone call, a walk, he had not asked. And found him in the lobby. "You were quiet at breakfast," she said. He looked at her. "Was I?" She picked up her bag. "The boutique's open at 10. I thought we could look at that bracelet I mentioned." He said, "I want to talk about what happened." She looked at him with an expression he recognized. The slight tightening around the eyes that meant she had assessed the conversation and already decided how it would end. "The woman was clumsy," Vivian said. "If you work in hospitality, you learn not to." "She is 60 years old," James said. "And she has worked here for 11 years. Vivian looked at him. "What?" she said. "Are you defending the staff now?" "I am asking you," he said carefully, "whether you think what you did was reasonable." Vivian tilted her head. The smile came back. The one that was not kind. "You sound like hotel staff," she said. "It is quite unattractive." James looked at his wife. He thought about the night they had met. The charity dinner where she had been the most interesting person in the room, quick and sharp, and warm in the way that made you want to stay in her orbit. He had fallen for that version, and proposed to her. He had been trying for 6 months to find her again. He said, "I am going to stay down here for a bit." She left. He went to the front desk and asked if he could speak with the manager. The manager came, a professional man in his 40s named Mr. Adeyemi. James told him what he had witnessed. He did not dramatize it. He simply said that one of the breakfast servers had handled a difficult situation with considerable professionalism and that he wanted that noted in her file. He said the older server, Grace, should know that what happened to her was witnessed and was not acceptable. Mr. Adeyemi listened. He said, "Thank you, sir." He made a note. James said, "The young woman's name was Clara, I think. On her name badge." Mr. Adeyemi said, "Yes, Clara. She is one of our best. James nodded. He thought so. He went and sat in the hotel garden. The garden was quiet at this hour. It was the kind of quiet that hotels and cities work hard to manufacture. The careful planting of tall hedges, the strategic placement of water features, the understanding that people who pay a certain amount of money per night are paying partly for the right to pretend they are not in a city. James sat with his coffee and considered this. The pretending. How much of life was the careful arrangement of things to look like something other than what they were? He was good at seeing through that arrangement in business. It was why he'd made money, because he could sit across a table and understand the actual structure of a thing while other people were still reading the summary. He had been less good at it in his personal life. He was beginning to understand this about himself. There were several benches along a path beside the water feature. The sound of the water made the city noise distant enough to think. He sat down. He was 34 years old. He had built something real. He tried to build something real with another person, and he was sitting in a hotel garden at 9:30 in the morning watching it not work. He was still sitting there when he heard footsteps on the path. Clara was crossing the garden carrying a tray of glasses to the outdoor bar at the far end. She had not seen him. She was moving with the same unhurried efficiency he had noticed at breakfast, and she was humming something very softly. Not performatively, just the automatic sound of a person who is comfortable in their own presence. He said, "Excuse me." She stopped and looked at him. Professional composure. Immediate. "Can I help you, sir?" He said. "You are Clara. From breakfast." Something shifted in her expression. Not wariness, exactly. Awareness. "Yes," she said. He said, "I was at the table next to my wife." She waited. He said, "I wanted to tell you that I thought you handled that with a great deal of grace." He paused. "Both of you." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Grace has been here a long time. She deserves someone in her corner." He nodded. She started to move on. Then she stopped. She turned back. For a moment, he thought she was going to say something about Vivian. She did not. She said, "The water feature in this garden makes a sound that is really quite good for thinking." She said it without irony or performance, simply as information. Then she went to the outdoor bar with her tray. He sat in the garden for another 40 minutes. The sound of the water was, in fact, very good for thinking. What he thought about was this. He had made a decision about Vivian 8 months ago based on a version of her that he was no longer sure had been real. And he had spent 6 months adjusting, accommodating, waiting for the version he had chosen to reappear. Watching this morning had clarified something. The version he had proposed to had not gone anywhere. It had simply never existed. What he had seen in the charity dinner warmth was what he had wanted to see, which was different. He went upstairs. Vivian was on the phone. She had bought the bracelet. It was on the desk in its white box. He waited until she was done. He said, "I think we need to talk properly." She sat on the edge of the bed and crossed her legs and looked at him with the expression of someone who has had this conversation before and knows how it ends. But this time, he said things he had not said before. He said that what he'd watched this morning was the 3rd time in 8 months that he'd seen her do something that he could not explain away. He said that he had spent those months trying to be fair, trying to allow for stress and circumstance, trying to extend the benefit of the doubt. He said that this morning he had run out of doubt to extend. Vivian listened. When he finished, she said, "You are being dramatic." He said, "I am not going to argue about whether I am being dramatic." She said, "You have known me for 2 years. One bad morning, and you." "It was not one bad morning," he said. "That is the problem." The conversation that followed was not short. It had the specific, exhausting quality of conversations where two people are saying different things in the same words, and neither of them can find the translation. By the end of it, nothing was resolved in the way conversations want to be resolved, but something had shifted. The thing that had been pretending it could hold had stopped pretending. He did not ask her to leave. They were at a hotel. She left anyway, 2 hours later, in the way that people leave when they want the leaving to make a statement. He sat in the room for a while. Then he went back to the garden. Clara was not there. It was past her shift. But the water feature was still making its sound, and the garden was still quiet, and he sat on the bench he had sat on before, and thought about the fact that in the middle of the worst morning he had had in recent memory, the person who had made the most sense was someone whose name he had only learned from a manager's note. He lay awake for a long time that night. Vivian had not come back to the room, which answered one question. The room was very quiet. Through the window the city did its night work. The occasional car, the ambient glow of buildings that never fully went dark. He thought about the conversation he had tried to have. Not the words, but the shape of it. The way she had looked at him when he said the things he had said, like he was being unreasonable in a language she did not speak. He understood that she genuinely did not understand what the problem was. That was not a defense of her. It was something more troubling than a defense. He slept eventually. Not well. The following morning, he came down to breakfast early. Clara was not on the floor yet. Grace was, moving slowly along the far wall, restocking. She looked up when he came in. Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile or recognition. He said good morning. She said good morning, sir. He sat at table 7. When Clara came on shift 20 minutes later, she saw him there and came over with the same professional composure. Good morning, she said. Can I start you with something? Just coffee, he said. And I would like to ask you something if that is all right. She held her tray and waited. He said, do you always say what you think? Or only when you are defending someone else? She considered that. She said, I try to say what is true. Sometimes that is the same as saying what I think. Not always. He looked at his coffee cup. Did you know that was my wife? He said, yesterday. She looked at him. She said, I saw you sitting together at breakfast. And yet, she looked at him directly. What she did to Grace was wrong, she said. That does not change based on who the people involved are married to. He nodded. She refilled his coffee from the pot she was carrying and moved on to the next table. He ate breakfast. He read nothing. He thought about character, how some people spent their whole lives constructing it and still could not quite make it real, and how some people simply had it the way they had brown eyes or a particular walk, built in at a level below decision. He checked out of the hotel at noon. He left a note at the front desk for Mr. Adeyemi. It said that he would be recommending the Grand Ivory to colleagues and that the quality of the staff, specifically Clara from breakfast service and Grace from the same, was exceptional. He left his business card. He said that if either of those staff members ever required a reference or a professional opportunity, they should feel free to have the manager contact him directly. He did not leave the note to engineer anything. He left it because it was true, and because he'd spent the morning thinking about the fact that people who do the right thing quietly rarely hear that anyone noticed. He drove back to the city. A week later, his phone rang. It was Mr. Adeyemi. He said he wanted to pass along something. He said that Clara had asked him to convey a message. She wanted James to know that Grace was fine, that the hotel had given Grace 3 days of paid rest and a formal apology, and that Grace wanted to thank whoever had spoken to management on her behalf. James said, how did she know it was me? Mr. Adeyemi said, she said she recognized your face from the business section of the newspaper. She said she had been reading it for 2 years because she was studying for her hospitality management exams and wanted to understand how businesses were run. James was quiet for a moment. He said, she knew who I was the whole time? Yes, sir, Mr. Adeyemi said. She said she thought you should know that she did not treat you any differently because of it. James sat in his office chair and looked out of the window at the city doing its daily work. He said to Mr. Adeyemi, could you pass along my number? Not to push anything. Just in case she wants to ask those business questions directly. Mr. Adeyemi said he would. He thought about that for the rest of the day. She had known, possibly from the first morning, certainly by the second. He did not know when she had made the connection. And she had stood in front of him with a coffee pot and answered his questions about whether she always said what she thought, and she had refilled his cup and moved to the next table, and at no point had her expression shifted into the particular register that recognition of his name usually produced in people. The slight recalibration. The awareness of what was now possible. He had spent his adult life learning to read that shift. He looked for it at dinners, at meetings, at social events where someone's assistant had presumably briefed them on who was in the room. It happened almost always. Not always dramatically, but always. A fraction of a degree. An adjustment. There had been no adjustment. He sat in his office and thought about what it meant to treat someone as a person when you knew they had something you might want. It meant, he understood, that you had decided they were worth treating as a person regardless of what they had. That was rarer than it should have been. 3 days later, Clara sent a message. It said, I have 3 questions about the service industry that the newspapers cannot answer. Would you be willing to have a 30-minute call? He wrote back, yes, though I suspect the call might run longer. It ran 2 hours. After that there was another call. And a coffee. And a conversation in the hotel garden that he had specifically suggested because the water feature was very good for thinking, and he had something to think about. Vivian filed for divorce 4 months after the hotel. Her lawyer sent the papers. James's lawyer handled it. The bracelet stayed with Vivian. Everything else was resolved without drama, which was the cleanest way. He did not think about her often. When he did, what he thought about was not the charity dinner or the marriage, or even the conversation in the hotel room. What he thought about was the breakfast room that morning, the slap, the silence, the woman who had walked calmly across the floor and said, "We will not accept our staff being treated that way." He thought about character, how it showed up when nobody was watching. Except someone always was. Clara passed her hospitality management exams 8 months after the hotel. He sent her a message that said congratulations. She sent one back that said I could not have done the business strategy section without the 2-hour call. He replied that she had been the one answering all the questions. By then the 30-minute call and the 2-hour call and the coffee and the garden conversation had become other things. Dinners and early morning walks before either of them went to work, and the specific ease of two people who had decided, without formally deciding, that the other person was worth being honest with. He told her, one evening over a meal she had cooked in her small apartment, that he had known about the newspaper. That she had recognized him. She said, "I know you knew. Mr. Adeyemi told you." He said, "I meant that I knew before that. I figured it out." She put down her fork. "When?" "The second morning," he said. "When you came to take my order, and your expression was exactly the same as the morning before. It was the same expression you used for every table. No adjustment. No awareness of who was sitting there." He looked at her. Most people, when they recognize someone, there is a shift. Something changes. With you, nothing changed. She considered that. She said, "Nothing should change." He said, "I know. That is why I noticed." She picked up her fork again. He said, "Were you not curious? About why I was still there? After what happened with Vivian?" She said, "I thought that was your business." She paused. "And I thought you were probably having a difficult time, and the garden was helping." He looked at her across the small table in the small apartment. He said, "It was helping." She said, "I know. The water feature in that garden is genuinely very good." He asked her, 3 months before the wedding, whether she was certain. Not as a test. He was finished with tests. As a genuine question, because she was 27 and he was 35 and those 8 years had given him different things to be careful about, and he wanted to be careful about this correctly. She said, "I was certain before you asked." He said, "How long before?" She said, "The morning you sat at table 7 and ordered just coffee and asked if it was all right to ask me something." He said, "That was the second morning. I had already seen you the morning before." She said, "I know. But the second morning was when you came back." He looked at her. He thought about the person he had been when he walked into that breakfast room. The specific weight of someone whose understanding of a person had just fundamentally shifted, who was sitting with the remains of something and had not yet decided what to do with them. He said, "I was in a bad place that morning." She said, "I know that too." She said, "You ordered just coffee and you did not read anything, and you looked at the table." She paused. Someone in a bad place who is still paying attention to other people is usually a good person. He said, "You concluded all that from a coffee order." She said, "I concluded it from 18 months of watching people over breakfast." She almost smiled. It was a very efficient research method. He said, "Hospitality management." She said, "And 2 years of the business section." They married the following year. Not at the Grand Ivory, though Mr. Adeyemi sent flowers. Small, private, the people who mattered. Grace was there in a green dress she had bought specifically, and she cried from the beginning and did not stop until the food came. It was not the wedding of a billionaire and a hotel server. It was the wedding of two people who had found each other at a moment when they were both being exactly who they were, without performance, without strategy, without the protection of a role. He had been a man watching his marriage end. She had been a woman defending a colleague who could not defend herself. And the thing that happened between those 2 moments was simply this. One person recognizing another, the way you recognize a sound you have been waiting to hear.